Hey everyone, and welcome to Build XYZ. On today's video, we're going to be transforming an old Builder Special entranceway into this nice, new, sleek, modern looking one that's behind me. So I recommend going down to your local big box store and checking if they have any slabs on sale. The idea is that you buy these slabs and then you just bolt some legs that they also sell onto them, and then you have like an instant table. I think these slabs were so badly warped that they could not be used as tables, and since I was going to be refinishing them and resurfacing them anyways, I figured that they'd be perfect for this project. And if you're wanting more specific details about finished heights and dimensions, I'll be sure to put a PDF in the links below with all this information. So let's kick this project off by demolishing the original entranceway bench. Now, I was actually pretty surprised to see that this column you see here is just a 10-inch plastic pipe with plaster rings on the top and the bottom. Now that we're back to a clean slate, we can begin by framing in for our new entranceway bench. I started by setting up my laser level and then transferring those lines to the drywall. I chose to remove the drywall anywhere where I was going to be mounting framing. This is not an essential step, and you could just mount the framing right over the drywall. The next step was to measure, cut, and install all the framing members. In order to execute the flush trim, we need to first cut a spacer to hang our drywall. The drywall can then be placed on top of this 2 1/4 inch spacer before it's fastened into place. And then the spacer can be easily removed. Here I'm using a staple gun to mount all of the metal drywood edging. Since I was already adding crown molding to everywhere else in this room, I decided to carry on and continue that crown molding around this entranceway bench. I applied 3 coats of mud and then did a final sanding with 220 grit sandpaper. The drywall was then coated with 1 coat of primer before heading on to 2 coats of paint. Each cut was completed in 4 passes. This reduces the load on the saw. The 4 slabs I'm resurfacing are only 45 inches long, which means I can make use of the flat surface on my table saw, which is 48 inches long, to be able to register off a nice, true cast iron surface. The sled that I'm going to be using was made for a project I did quite a while back. Now, I've enlarged the track to 2 1/4 inches to accommodate a larger surfacing router bit that I'll be using. This jig is assembled by mounting the MDF runners to the table saw using fence clamps, with 2 additional clamps on either ends to hold pressure and the jig together. You can experiment with how much material you're actually removing with each pass. I found it optimal to remove about 1/2 inch of material with each pass. After about 3 hours of milling, my shop is a complete mess, and these things are completely flat now and they do not wobble at all. The next step I want to do is insert these butterfly keys into 2 places specifically that have cracks that I don't want to continue, and they just look cool. This is my first time attempting a butterfly joint like this, and to do it I created a very simple jig. When installing butterfly keys, first adhere them to the workpiece with double-sided tape. Then trace around the key using a sharp X-Acto knife to break up all the surface wood fibers. This will leave you with a nice clean chisel line. Then you can chisel away enough material to leave the butterfly key sticking out a little bit proud. You can also plunge in a small router bit to remove a bunch of material at once. Apply some wood glue and then hammer in the butterfly key using a soft mallet. I used the sawdust from previously sanding the slabs to fill in any joint imperfections. So I'm going to try to remove some of this cheap filler material. You can see here they have some of this glue sawdust compound that they use. I want to bring it back to its original state, you know, where we can start to fill some of these holes and crevices and knots with epoxy. So we're going to chop some of this away. So for this, I'm going to be using a general purpose resin system from System 3, and I'm going to be tinting it with some Walnut Trans Tint, which I have a bunch of these, and they work really well. Pouring epoxy can be a very slow process. You often have to return to previously poured joints and make sure that all the voids and cracks are all filled up to the top. And a blowtorch is very effective at removing all those little surface bubbles. Once the epoxy has cured overnight, I return and resurface all of the areas where I poured epoxy. I won't bore you with a whole bunch of sanding, but I did start at 80 grit and work my way up to 220 grit. I ran one edge of the slabs through the joiner so I'd have a nice straight edge for the table saw. The table saw was set at 5 degrees to create a bevel on all of the edges. A roundover bit was then used to soften the top edge. Each slab was then cut to length using a crosscut sled. The bottom trim was created from an offcut, which was run through the table saw and milled down to be 5/8 thick, which is the thickness of the drywall. The finish I'm using here is Watco oil-based satin polyurethane. This was sprayed through an HVLP gun using a protective mask. The bottom can now be assembled. I start by applying some wood glue and then laying down the bottom slab. When it's in its final position, I place some heavy weights to apply pressure while the glue cures. The bottom trim was then cut on the miter saw and mitered at a 45-degree angle. Wood glue was then applied to the back of the trim. The trim was held in place with clamps for the next 4 hours while the glue cured. The 45-degree angles on the end piece were treated with some wood glue before being fastened with a 28-gauge pin nailer. Now we're going to switch gears and work on the Walnut Reveal. 13.5-inch wide strips were cut from a sheet of 5/8 MDF. Walnut iron-on edging was then applied to both exposed edges. The walnut edging was then given 2 coats of water-based polyurethane. The MDF panels were then cut to the proper length. The boards were then mounted using PL construction adhesive and a staple gun. And so the final bit of trim we have to make is at a 3/4 inch MDF, and it's ultimately what gets painted white and what you see in the final finished product. A very small bevel was applied to the edges to give them a more finished look. Here, I'm pre-drilling all the holes. This will make finishing and filling them later an easier task. This includes the mounting holes for all of the IKEA hangers. I then applied 1 coat of primer and 2 coats of paint. MDF can be very tricky on the edges, and you must sand in between coats in order to get a smooth finish. The white trim was then mounted. Again, I pre-drill all my holes when working with MDF. A bead of PL construction adhesive is applied on the top edge before sliding the slabs into place. A laser level was used to help vertically align the panels. All the mounting holes were then filled with 2 coats of drywall compound and then topped with a final coat of paint. And to finish this thing off, I mounted the 6 IKEA coat hangers. And that concludes this video. Thanks for sticking around. We went from a design to a complete entranceway bench. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. You can also check me out on Instagram for all my project updates. Thanks, and see you next time.